Hi there! My name is Megan and I'm the owner of My Time Patterns. Today I'm going to show you how I sewed the coat for my Alucard cosplay. If you want to follow along and make your own Alucard cosplay, you can find the patterns for the coat, shirt, and pants in the description below. Or if you're interested in learning to make your own cosplay patterns custom to your measurements, I'm developing a cosplay pattern making course that will be coming out in the near future. Check out the link in the description to know when that goes live. I'd also like to start with a disclaimer about the pattern. I have made several updates/improvements to the pattern since I filmed this video. So if you go get the pattern right now and it doesn't look exactly like it does in this video, don't worry, it's the same exact pattern, the instructions work the same exact way, you've just got a more refined version than the one that I was working with. Anyway, let's get started. First, open the pattern in Adobe Reader. Before you print the whole pattern, you'll want to print just the first page to make sure the scale is correct. To do this, go to File, Print, select your printer, then under Pages to Print, select Pages and type in 1. Then, make sure under the Size menu that Actual Size is selected, then press Print. Each of the gray squares should measure 1 inch by 1 inch. If they don't, you'll need to mess around with your printer settings and print more test pages until they do. Once you've made sure the scale is correct, you'll print the whole pattern by clicking File, Print, select your printer, triple check that the size is correct, and then press Print. Once all the pages are printed, you'll need to lay them out in order and tape them together, matching up the gray squares. Next, roughly cut around each of the pattern pieces. Once that's done, lay out your outer fabric, in this case, our black wool blend. Grab all the pattern pieces that say Self, and pin them to the fabric, paying attention to how many each piece says to cut. Then, cut out each of the pattern pieces, cutting through both layers of fabric, making sure to cut along the outermost lines of the pattern. Make sure you transfer all markings, such as darts and notches. Then, remove the patterns from the fabric and connect all the marks and notches for the darts, making sure to mirror the marks for the second fabric piece. Next, do the same thing for the lining. Lay out your lining fabric, then pin all the pattern pieces that say lining to the lining fabric. Notice that the back lining pattern pieces say cut 1 rather than cut 2, so for these I made sure to only pin them to 1 layer of fabric each. Brownie points if you actually iron your fabric before pinning like you're supposed to, but I'm lazy. Even more brownie points if you iron each of your seams after you sew them. For real, you should 1000% do this if you have time. It makes such a difference and it makes everything look way more professional. Once all the lining pieces are pinned, cut them out along the outermost lines of the pattern, and make sure to transfer darts and notches. Then, once again, remove the patterns from the fabric and connect all the marks and notches for the darts, making sure to mirror the marks for the second fabric piece. Finally, do the same process for your interfacing. Lay it out, pin the interfacing pattern pieces on, and cut them out along the outermost line, transferring notches. Next, pin every dart closed. Then, take each piece over to the sewing machine and sew each dart closed by starting at the open end of the dart legs and backstitching, then sewing all the way to the dart tip, making sure not to backstitch at the dart tip. Pull the piece out from the machine a little bit before trimming the threads, then take those threads and tie them in a knot to secure the tip. For the double-ended or fish-eye darts, start at the widest point, backstitch, and then stitch down to the tip of the dart, making sure not to backstitch at the tip of the dart. Once again, leave a little bit of thread at the end to tie into a knot. Then go back to the widest point of the dart and do the same thing in the other direction. Don't forget to trim your loose threads as you go to make your life easier later on. Repeat this process for every dart, including those on the lining pieces. Next, pin your interfacing pieces to the collar lining and cuff self pieces. Be sure to note that though the cuff pieces look pretty symmetrical, they are not. So they do have a right and a wrong side, so make sure you have one going one way and one going the other. Then take them over to your sewing machine and starting with the collar, start in the center of either of the long edges, sew towards the short edge, backstitching at the beginning and the end. Then turn the piece around and starting at the same middle point, sew towards the short edge in the other direction. Do this for both the tops and bottoms of each of these pieces. Then sew down the short sides of each piece. Doing it this way is a little bit of a pain, but it helps to make sure that your fabric stays flush and lined up with the interfacing. You can, and probably should, do the same for the cuff pieces, but the pieces are small enough and the self fabric is thick enough that I was lazy and just went in a circle all the way around for both of them. And now that our pieces are all prepped, we can start putting them together. With right sides together, pin the self backs together from the neckline until the outer vent corner, matching the notches together. Then, right sides together, pin the self fronts to the self backs at the side seams and the shoulder seams. Then take that over to your sewing machine and sew each of those seams, the sides, the shoulders, and the center back from the top down to the outer point of the vent, making sure to backstitch at the beginning and end of each of those lines. Next, we'll do the same thing for the lining. With right sides together, pin the lining backs together until the inner vent corner this time. Then pin the lining fronts to the lining backs at the side seams, and pin the lining fronts to the front facings. I'm using wonder clips here instead of pins since this fabric is pretty slippery, but you can totally use pins here too. Then go back to your sewing machine and sew each of those seams just like before. Front seams, side seams, and center back seam from the top to the inner vent edge. For the center back seam, once you get to the top of the vent, make sure the needle is down into the fabric, then match the top vent edges together. You might need to snip the inner edge of the protruding piece to get them to line up nicely. Then sew that part down and stop. Once again, don't forget to backstitch at the beginning and end of each of these seams. Then sew the lining backs to the lining/facing fronts at the shoulders. Next, pin the upper edge of the sleeve cuff to the self sleeve, right sides together. This is what I was talking about before with the pattern being updated. The older version of the pattern had the cuff overlap on the sleeve, but it shouldn't anymore. Then take those over to the machine and stitch them down. Then take those over to the iron and give them a good press. Then take the sleeves back to the sewing machine and set your stitch length to the longest it goes. Starting at one notch on the sleeve cap and going all the way to the other, sew along the top edge of the sleeve within the seam allowance, meaning closer to the edge than your normal stitches. And this time don't backstitch at all. This will be used later to fit the sleeve into the armhole. With right sides together, pin the self-sleeve side seams together. Say that 10 times fast. And with a regular stitch length, sew them closed. Then take your lining sleeves and with the long basting stitch again, sew within the seam allowance of the sleeve cap from one notch to the other without backstitching. Same thing as before, this will be used later to gather the top of the sleeve so it fits in the armhole. Next, pin the lining sleeve seams right side together. And sew those closed as well. Then take your self armhole and the sleeve with the matching notches, one notch in the front and two notches in the back, and pin the self sleeves into the self armholes, right sides together, by matching up the seams and notches. Then pull on one of the threads to gather the sleeve until it is the same width as the armhole, and pin it in place. Then do the same thing for the lining sleeves into the lining armholes. Then take them over to the machine and carefully stitch each of the sleeves in. This part is kind of a pain in the butt, but do your best. Sleeves are the bane of my existence, so if you don't get it right on the first try or the 100th, don't feel bad. Sleeves are evil. Next, pin the self collar onto the self back, matching up the notches with the shoulder seams. Then for the lining, pin the lining collar to the lining back, matching the notches with the shoulder seams. Then smooth the lining towards the center and pin just a hair before the center and do the same thing on the other side. Then match the lining seam, the center seam, with the center of the collar and pin. Then pin the rest of the collar down. Then bring those both over to the sewing machine and stitch them down. Bring both your self and your lining to a large flat surface and lay them with right sides together. Then pin the collars together around the outside edges. Then line up the vents and, starting at the highest point, pin them together all the way around, right sides together. Sew the vents together, starting at the highest point and sewing down each leg of the vent. Then Sew around the outer 3 edges of the collar, leaving the needle down on the corners and turning the fabric. It can be helpful to backstitch at the corners before and after turning for stability. Clip the corners of the collar as close as you can to the stitching without losing the integrity of the corner. And trim away the interfacing in the seam allowance to reduce bulk. Then, snip into the seam allowance at the top point of the vent. Then turn the garment right side out, making sure to get the collar corners all the way out. And press the collar flat. Then, using the pattern for reference, mark where the front details should go. I'm using a tracing wheel here to poke through the paper and indent the fabric before tracing with chalk, but don't do it like me. It's way easier to just cut out the details from the paper beforehand and then just trace inside of them. Kind of like I ended up doing for the second one. Make sure your marks line up, and then pin down your trim. You can either machine stitch or hand stitch your trim down, but I'm doing it by hand because I accidentally did things out of order. Oops. Then sew on the buttons. Okay, so I also did this part out of order, so you're getting some spoilers here. But next you should pin the cuffs to the sleeve linings, right sides together, like this. Turn them back inside out, and then pin them all the way around. Then sew it down. This part is also a pain in the butt. Sleeves, am I right? Then fold it back out and press it, and repeat for the other sleeve. Bring the collar over to your sewing machine and top stitch around the edge of the collar for stability, backstitching at the corners. Then, with as long a stitch as your machine allows, baste the self and lining center fronts together, on both sides, wrong sides together, within the seam allowance. Then lay the vent flat and smooth the fabric over from the center front to the vent and press it. Do this for both sides of the vent. Then, pin the self to the lining at the hem. Bring it back to your machine and baste it just like you did the center fronts. For this next part, you can either use store-bought bias tape or you can make your own out of your lining fabric if you have enough left. Either way, you'll want to start at the vent, leaving a little bias tape past the edge. Then sew it down a ½ inch from the edge. When you get to the corner, stop about a ½ inch from the edge, then with the needle down, pick up the presser foot and rotate the garment in order to sew right off the corner. Then you'll fold the bias tape back along the angle you just sewed, then fold it back again to the angle of the hem. You can play this bit back a few times if you need to. It hurts my brain a little bit too. Then, starting from the edge, sew along the stitching line again, being sure to backstitch. When you get to the chest details, depending on what type of material you used, you might want to trim it within the seam allowance to reduce bulk. When you get to each of the next corners, repeat the process from the first corner. It's a little trickier on the collar corners since they're pointier, but the key is to get the bias tape lined up with the edge of the collar both along that second fold and along the raw edge of the bias tape. Continue doing this all the way around the garment. Okay, so I lost the footage for the beginning of folding over the bias tape, so I'm using some scraps I had lying around to show you this next part. You'll want to start at one of the raw edges of the vent and fold the bias tape hanging off the edge into itself, then holding that piece in place, fold the bias tape up and secure it with a pin or clip. Then pin the rest of the bias tape in place, making sure the side you fold over reaches past the stitching line you made when you put the bias tape on to begin with. When you get to a corner, keep the leading edge flat. It can help to pin it to keep it in place. Then fold the other side over and secure. Starting at one vent and making your way all the way around the garment to the other vent, stitch in the ditch on the outside of the garment around the bias tape, making sure you catch the inside folded edge of the bias tape in your stitching and trying not to catch the front of the bias tape in the stitching. I noticed I didn't fully catch the backside of the bias tape at the very end here, so I adjusted it using my seam ripper to help me get in there, and re-sewed it. When you're done, give it all a good press. And probably lint roll it if your sewing space is as lint and thread ridden as mine. And our Alucard coat is done! If you made it this far in the video, congrats! I know this video is a long one and this is a long project, so congrats on finishing it. I hope you had a good time, or at least that this pattern and this video made your life a little easier. If you haven't gotten it already, you can get this pattern and more on my Etsy store, link below. And if you're interested in learning how to make your own sewing pattern specific to your measurements, check out my future cosplay pattern making course on my website, mytimepatterns.net, also link below. My Alucard pattern comes with a shirt and pant pattern too, so I'll probably be making a sewing video for those in the future as well as for all of the patterns in my store moving forward. So be sure to subscribe for more in-depth cosplay sewing tutorials. And if you have any costumes you'd like me to make patterns for next, leave a comment, let me know. Thanks so much for watching. Bye!